The year is 2020. Alexander Lukashenko, the longtime president of Belarus, is facing his toughest election yet. For 26 years, Lukashenko has ruled with an iron fist, suppressing dissent and silencing critics. This time, however, the opposition is energized and the Belarusian people are fed up. The election is marred by widespread fraud, and Lukashenko claims victory. The people, however, are having none of it. They take to the streets in protest, demanding a free and fair election and calling for Lukashenko to step down. The protests quickly escalate into a national movement as people from all walks of life come together to demand change. The government responds with brutal force, detaining thousands of protesters and using violence to silence dissent. But the protests continue, showing no signs of abating. The situation is volatile, and the future of Belarus is uncertain. What happens next? This is a story of a country in turmoil. Belarus, once known as the last dictatorship in Europe, has seen a surge in opposition to its authoritarian leader. This surge was ignited in the 2020 presidential election. The incumbent, Alexander Lukashenko, declared victory, as he had done for every election since 1994. However, May suspected widespread fraud and a rigged vote. People took to the streets in protest, chanting for Lukashenko to leave power. Despite the authorities' violent crackdown and threats, the protesters continued to demand freedom and fair elections. Lukashenko's grip on power was slipping, and the world watched to see what would happen. The 2020 Belarusian presidential election was a historic event. The protests that followed were some of the biggest in Belarus history. These protests were fueled by the belief that the election was rigged and that Lukashenko's rule had become too oppressive. The protests were met with brutal force by the government, but they continue. The government's response was condemned by many countries, including the European Union, which imposed sanctions. The protests had a profound impact on Belarus, leading to the country's worst political crisis since independence. Despite the crackdown, the opposition has remained active and the protests continue. The situation in Belarus remains fluid, but the protests have shown that the Belarusian people are willing to fight for their freedom.